The other day, Tim Pool tweeted out, "It should be illegal to not believe in God." Now, I have no interest in Tim Pool one way or the other, but based on what little I know of him, I struggle to believe that he meant this unironically. What I imagine is that after saying this, he went on to make some larger point based upon the responses he got. But this tweet is not the focus of this video. This tweet is. Now, I don't know anything about the individual who made this tweet, so this video and the things that I say within it are not directed at them. The reason I want to cover this tweet is because it expresses a very commonly expressed sentiment concerning the relationship between God and science. But before I get to that, I want to talk about some of the playlists that I made across the weekend, because previously I had 4 playlists that were based upon the way that I divide up reality. So I had a material playlist, an intellectual playlist, an ethereal playlist, and a spiritual playlist. But the problem with those playlists is that sometimes I would make a video and I realized that it could rightly fit into more than one of those playlists, and so it became kind of confusing. And so I've created 4 new playlists that I think are named in a way that is very helpful, not only to you guys, but to me. For example, Monday Mysticism. Not only does that let people know exactly what the videos within the playlist are about, namely mysticism, but it also lets you guys know that you can expect my videos on mysticism on a Monday. And that's helpful for me as well, because I never lack things to talk about, but when you have to come up with 5 video ideas each week, and those videos could be about absolutely anything that have to do with spirituality, it's rather hard. So it's very useful to give myself some kind of guidance on that matter, so that each week I know, okay, on Monday I'm doing a video about mysticism. And then we have the Tuesday Texts playlist, and I have to say a few things about this one. This was originally about occultism, but I realised that those videos could fit just as well into the Monday Mysticism playlist. And the reason I didn't call this particular playlist Scripture is because even though I do primarily examine Scripture on this channel, I don't want to exclusively do that. There are certain philosophical texts I'll also want to cover on this channel as well, such as Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Now, on this channel, I have covered more texts than are suggested by the presence of this one video in this playlist, of course. But this playlist is specifically for those occasions where I exegete a text from beginning to end. And I've done that quite a lot on Patreon, but as far as my public channel is concerned, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is the only time I've sat down and gone through a text from beginning to end. But tomorrow is a Tuesday, and so tomorrow I will be beginning to go through all 114 sayings of the Gospel of Thomas, one each week. And that was another good reason for me to have a playlist specifically for texts, because I don't want any of my other playlists to be held up for 114 weeks while I go through the Gospel of Thomas. So that's Tuesday texts. Now, Wednesdays are obviously the days for my Patreon videos, so there's no playlist for it here. Then we have the Thursday Theology playlist. This is when I consider a certain theological matter, and that may or may not involve having a look at different sacred texts. And then we have the Friday Folklore playlist. And this was a good playlist to put all of those videos that I've made concerning supernatural phenomenon and great mysteries here in the world. And these are invariably some of my more popular videos for whatever reason. So those are the new playlists. I think they're nicely named. I think that the naming convention that I've come up with is very informative and very useful, not just for you guys, but for me. So let's return to the tweet that is the subject of this video and see what it says. God's existence is BS due to lack of empirical evidence. The presence of natural explanations for phenomena attributed to God and the inconsistencies and contradictions within religious texts. The scientific method can't support the existence of our supernatural deity. So let's read that again. God's existence is BS due to a lack of empirical evidence, the presence of natural explanations for phenomena attributed to God, and the inconsistencies and contradictions within religious texts. So I would point out immediately that God and the religious texts written about God are 2 separate things, mainly because those religious texts are written by men, whether held to be divinely inspired or not. But this last sentence here, the scientific method simply can't support the existence of a supernatural deity, that is actually completely correct, just not in the way that this individual supposes. So let's talk about science very briefly. Science is obviously a good thing. Without that science, I wouldn't be able to communicate with you in the way that I'm doing now. But what you invariably find is that those who want to emphasize science the most, those who want to present themselves as being concerned with science the most, are those that tend to understand it the least, because they present it as being infallible and they give themselves away in some subtle ways when they're expressing themselves. For example, if you see someone capitalize science in a sentence, it could be that they just flat out don't understand that that word shouldn't be capitalized in a sentence unless it comes at the beginning of a sentence. But it more often than not is an indicator that they view science as something that it's not, namely as this infallible dispenser of answers, when of course the reality is the scientific method is always evolving, science is always learning new things, and what that means is that science, the science of the day, is often quite wrong and will remain so until it corrects itself. So in responding to a statement like this, what you should not do is what the vast majority of responses to this tweet have done, which is to respond to the objections to the existence of God on a material basis. For example, this individual here has made quite a common counter-argument. They have said, the evidence of a designer/creator is overwhelming. Just look at the human eye, for Pete's sake. There is no chance that created itself from nothingness. The evidence you are referring to is that of a deity who has a plan for us and/or wants something from us, a separate argument. So it's not that such counter-arguments are misguided. It's not that they're wrong necessarily. It's just that if you're going to argue on material terms, then you're going to end up going round in circles, because there's no way to get out of that loop, because there's no way to prove the origin of matter one way or another. It's why I have very little time, like for those apologists who want to make all of these arguments based upon the writings of what Thomas Aquinas argued and things like that, because I just think it's pointless. Those debates can go on forever, and that's why they've been going on for a very long time now. So the first thing to point out is that when we use the word science, when individuals like this use the word science, and when the word science is used in these kind of contexts, what is being referred to is explicitly material science. It is a science that is used to examine and understand the natural world. And there is your first clue as to why science, as this individual points out in our last sentence, can't support the existence of a supernatural deity. Now, I divide reality up into 4 categories, as I said earlier: matter, mind, aether, and spirit. But most individuals would stick to 3 categories, namely those of matter, mind, and spirit. And the reason humanity has developed these concepts and these words to point to these concepts is because they recognize that there are different orders of reality. So, recognizing that science, spoken of in this context, is explicitly material science, it's obviously folly to expect that material science would be able to significantly wrestle with or substantiate something that comes from a different order of reality. Why would you expect material science to be able to substantiate God, who is of a different order, and an order that transcends the material reality that science explicitly deals with? That is the issue in view here. That's why she's actually right in her last sentence. The scientific method simply can't support the existence of a supernatural deity. That's right, it can't. But it's not because, as this individual thinks, God doesn't exist. It's because the scientific method can't wrestle with something and can't analyze something that is not matter. And God, by definition, is not matter. God is spirit. And the problem with the assumption that so many atheists make, and I don't really like the term atheist, I think that when you're talking about individuals like this, the term materialist is far superior, because an atheist is merely one who rejects the existence of a god or gods. They could still believe in other supernatural phenomenon, like ghosts, for example, but that's not what you see when you're interacting with these kind of individuals. You see someone who rejects all supernatural claims, gods or otherwise, and so I think the term materialist is far superior and is a far better descriptor. But these materialists tend to assume, as this individual seems to assume, that if material science cannot substantiate something, then there is no good reason to even entertain that thing, which is to make the assumption that all that exists can be examined and understood and probed, and therefore proven by material science, which is a huge assumption and is one that is not backed up by our day-to-day experience of reality. There are so many things that we experience from day to day that science cannot get to grips with, and yet it is a phenomenon that we all accept exists. Science, for example, cannot come to get to grips with a thought. Thoughts are of a different order than matter, which is why we have terms like matter and mind to distinguish the two. You can't get a thought into a test tube, for example. Science can look at the human brain and it can speculate about the origins of consciousness, and it can argue that the brain is the creator of that consciousness and the thoughts that are within it, but science itself cannot get to grips with those thoughts or with that consciousness. And speaking of consciousness, I used the word spirit earlier. God is spirit. This is a commonly accepted truth within spirituality, and yet that is quite a frustration for many materialists, because to them the word spirit means very little. And indeed, even to many religious individuals or those who would describe themselves as being spiritual, they don't really understand what spirit is exactly. As I said in my book, to them, when they think of the word spirit, they are imagining some magical or spectacle manifesting in the material realm. Some supernatural, magical, bright, colorful phenomenon manifesting in the material realm when they think of the word spirit. And this is based on the way that spirit has so often been portrayed. But when the ancients used the word spirit, they were referring to nothing other than our very consciousness, our very awareness. So when people say that God is spirit, what they're essentially saying is that God is, if you like, the intelligence behind all consciousness. It is the driving force behind all consciousness. The fact that we are conscious, the fact that we are aware, is the sense in which we are made in the image of God. Obviously, what distinguishes God from us while we are on this journey of individuality, in this case here in the material realm, is that God is ever conscious, and God is omnipresent. But we, for example, when we are living out this human experience, we go to sleep each night, and when we do that, unless we're having a dream or a nightmare of some kind, we don't even retain our awareness, we don't even retain that consciousness. You can imagine it like this. You can imagine God as being this great mass that has countless eyes on it, and as individual souls living out different experiences of individuality, we are like one of those eyes on that great form. Now, when we go to sleep at night, our eye closes, but the other eyes of those souls who are not asleep and who therefore retain their consciousness, retain their awareness, they are still open. And of course, God, being the totality of that consciousness, is always present and always aware. Now, what happens to us beyond the material realm? Well, that's beyond the scope of this video. But the point is that when the ancients used the word spirit, they were referring to nothing other than consciousness. They were referring to nothing other than awareness itself. And consciousness has always been a tremendous problem for material science, because as with
thoughts themselves, while material science can assert that the brain is the generator of consciousness based on the fact that when you manipulate the brain in certain ways, you can affect someone's consciousness. Someone can always argue the opposite, that the brain is actually the receptor of consciousness, and messing with the brain would therefore have the same result if that was the case. The important point here is that it must be recognized that we divide reality up into these different orders, into these different levels, for a reason. We talk about material reality, we talk about the psychic realm or the mental realm, and we speak about spirit for a reason. It's because humanity experiences and has consistently testified of different phenomena that clearly do not belong to the same order of experience. And it's interesting that this individual should use the word empirical here because, testimony is important. The testimony of people's experiences is important. And there are few things that humanity has testified of so universally throughout history than some kind of transcendent experience that involves that which we would call spirit. So for a fringe group in the modern day to come along and boldly assert that all such testimonies are delusion or simply untruths based on the fact that a science that is explicitly material cannot substantiate such claims is both hubristic in the extreme and misguided, because material science by definition cannot wrestle with that, cannot grasp that, which itself is not matter. And when you are speaking of spiritual realities like God, you are explicitly speaking of that which is not material by nature. So again, this individual is completely correct in her final sentence. The scientific method simply can't support the existence of a supernatural deity. Now, this individual thinks they're right in saying that because they think that if science can't prove something, then there's no reason to believe in it. But she's actually correct because the scientific method can't support the existence of a supernatural deity, because the scientific method deals explicitly with material subject matter, and a supernatural deity is, by definition, not material in origin. Its ontology is not material. So, how do exactly we interact with a supernatural deity? How do we explore or examine God, if not through the scientific method? How do we verify the existence of God, if not through the scientific method? Well, the answer to that question lies in understanding what spirit is and therefore what God is. As I said earlier, spirit is consciousness. Therefore, to explore God, or to understand God, or to come to know God, involves exploring and understanding and coming to know our own consciousness. This is why religious traditions and spiritual traditions throughout history have emphasized introspective and contemplative practices such as prayer and meditation. In fact, people like to separate both prayer and meditation when really they are one and the same and they belong together. Because when you sit down to pray, for example, you are usually saying something to whatever god or gods you are addressing, but after prayer, you will tend to sit in silence. And it's that silence that's more important than whatever you might say in prayer. This is the reason that Jesus told his disciples, don't babble on like the Gentiles do. So whether people recognize it or not, after praying, they will typically engage in a form of meditation. And meditation itself is just that. It is sitting in silence. And the idea in meditation is not to focus on any one thing in particular, but rather to let your internal phenomenon, such as your thoughts and phenomenon, just simply be. Abide with them in that silence. And that's the key to all of this, is the silence, because the material realm, the mental realm, and the ethereal realm, they are made up of all kinds of different phenomena. That's how we interact with those realms. So the material realm is made up of all kinds of material phenomena, including other human beings. The mental realm consists of thoughts and concepts and ideas and all kinds of other phenomenon within that sphere. The ethereal realm consists of emotions, the intuition, the conscience. See, all of these things are different forms of phenomenon existing on these different levels of reality. What is distinct in spirit is that it is non-phenomenal, which is why the practices that I mentioned earlier, namely prayer and meditation, they are best conducted in silence, because it's within silence that you can hear from God, if you like. It's within silence it's through silence that God speaks. Silence is naturally the most subtle of things that we can experience, but there's many different forms of silence. When we think of silence here in the material realm, we think of audible silence, and that's ideally what we seek when we engage in prayer and meditation, precisely because it is the most subtle thing to be had in the material realm, and that enables us to more easily transcend the material realm into the more subtle realms, such as the mind, such as aether. But spirit itself is non-phenomenon, and therefore not only can science grasp with it, your mind can't either, your emotions can't either. These things, the ethereal realm, the mind and matter, they come from that original source that we call spirit, that we call God, but they in turn, being of a lower order than that original source, cannot then reach up and grasp that original source. The only reason we can do that, the only reason we can experience that original source through our contemplative practices, is for the reason that I stated earlier, that we are made in the image of God, in the sense that just as God is spirit, we are fundamentally spirit too. If that were not so, if we were just flesh and blood beings, then we would be incapable of having any experience of God, just as material science is and will always be incapable of proving God, because God is not only of a higher order of reality, he is of the highest order of reality and far transcends any material means of grasping at truth. So thank you for watching, and God willing, I'll see you tomorrow.